The NTSB has released its preliminary report on the 4 February 2026 Arizona DPS crash of the Bell 407 that resulted in 2 fatalities. We're going to take a look at the report and see if there's anything we can learn. So far, as usual, these things are preliminary, so it often raises more questions than answers, but we'll take a look at what their findings are so far.
3, 2, 1, flight off.
All right, so this is the accident investigation preliminary report of November 56 Alpha Zulu, which was Arizona DPS law enforcement helicopter. So on February 4th, 2026 at 10:16 Mountain Standard Time PM, so at night, Bell 407 was substantially damaged and was involved in an accident near Flagstaff, Arizona. Pilot and tactical flight officer were fatally injured. Helicopter was operated under Part 91 public use. The pilot and TFO began their 24-hour shift at 0800 on the day of the accident. So they had been up for a while. Don't know if fatigue was an issue, but this is late in the day when they had started their shift at 8 o'clock. They completed a previous flight to rescue hikers and returned to their base in Kingman about 8:05 p.m. So long day, second flight, both at night. They subsequently received a request for a mission flight in Flagstaff involving an active shooter in a neighborhood southeast of downtown. Flight was performed with the TFO occupying the left front seat and utilizing a forward-looking infrared camera to assist law enforcement personnel in assessing the scene from the air. Standard practice. TFO is talking to ground units and working the pod. The pilot is talking to ATC and ensuring that they're in a good orbit for a good track. Review of the FAA ADSB data, video and audio recorded by law enforcement body cams and resident security cameras revealed that the helicopter departed Kingman at about 21:10, so just about an hour after they rescued the hikers, and continued east toward Flagstaff. As the helicopter approached the city, the TFO was in communication with law enforcement personnel on the ground and provided the approximate location of the active shooter. At 10:05 p.m., the helicopter descended and operated between about 300 and 500 feet AGL. And remember, this is high altitude. So MSL is very high. AGL is very low. The helicopter then performed a gradual climbing left turn south of the active shooter before establishing a northerly course. There's the depiction. The pilot maneuvered the helicopter in a gradual climb north of the neighborhood and performed a left 180 to return south to allow clearance for a helicopter that was inbound to Flagstaff Medical Center. So it's a little bit of a distraction. And I've seen that. I've been on law enforcement missions where you're trying to look at a target and ATC is telling you, hey, there's traffic. You need to either climb, descend, get out of the way because they have to land and you have to adhere to that. At 22:12, so 10:12 p.m., while the helicopter was at an altitude of 9,950 feet MSL, it passed in the vicinity of the hospital-bound helicopter, which was on a northeast route at 7,200 feet MSL. Thereafter, the helicopter performed a left 360-degree turn and returned south towards the law enforcement scene while descending to 8,900 feet MSL. That's pretty high. Even with a turbine 407, that's pretty high. It's within what it's capable of doing, but it's still pretty high. The helicopter then turned north and performed a gradual climbing left turn, consistent with aligning for an out-of-ground effect hover, OGE, to maintain visual contact of the suspect. I personally do not like doing any OGE hovering when I'm doing law enforcement missions. I would prefer being in an orbit because having speed is helpful. At 10:16 p.m., the TFO initiated a radio transmission to law enforcement personnel on the ground. There were no indications of any abnormalities during the communication. So TFO is just talking to ground units. They're trying to work this active shooter. So this is the path, and you can see the speed, right? So green is 35 to 55 knots. Over 30 knots is what you'd want because that is translational lift. That's basically, it's flying like an airplane. It's getting lift from your forward motion. 17 to 35 knots, you're getting to that ATL. It's not great, but 10 to 17 is very bad, and red is you're in a hover. So you can see at the bottom right here, they're in that climbing left turn, and they descend to 0 to 10 knots. A review of the available video shows a helicopter in a slow climb, and then at 10:16:43, the helicopter began a rapid rotation to the right. The rotation coincided with an unidentified verbal sound on the radio, followed by 2 loud banging sounds from the helicopter. The helicopter then descended rapidly toward terrain at 10:16:51. The TFO stated over the radio, "We're going down." What an awful thing to hear. During the descent, the helicopter spotlight was observed in a video to flash periodically, consistent with continued aircraft rotation. So they rotated all the way to the ground. The main wreckage was located on a flat dirt access road about 3 miles north of Flagstaff Airport at an elevation of 7,000 feet. A section of the Burlington North Santa Fe railway tracks was located about 100 feet south of the main wreckage. The wreckage was distributed along a debris path on a median bearing of 250. The most distant wreckage was located more than 6,150 feet from the main wreckage. The main wreckage consisted of the cockpit, cabin, and aft fuselage, which came to rest on its right side. The cockpit and cabin exhibited extensive post-accident fire. The tail rotor, vertical stabilizer, and a section of the tail boom came to rest about 135 feet northwest from the main wreckage. So the tail boom and tail rotor, at some point during this, departed the aircraft. They were not at the same spot. The tail rotor drive shaft remained attached to the tail rotor gearbox and exhibited angular cuts at the forward section. The surrounding skin exhibited deep grooves with the blue paint transfer consistent with contact with the main rotor blade. So, main rotor blade hit the tail boom, chopped it off essentially. Tail boom was fractured at its forward location just aft of the intercostal support, and with structural remnants of the upper right attachment fitting exhibiting bending outboard. A section of forward tail boom and connected aft fuselage were torn away from the fuselage with one tail boom attach bolt intact connecting the two halves. The remaining 3 tail boom attach bolts were intact at the tail boom fuselage joint. The tail boom and the upper portion of the vertical fin exhibited multiple impact marks and punctures consistent with the main rotor blade strike sustained during the separation sequence. So this to me sounds like the loss of tail rotor effectiveness happened. So whatever caused the tail rotor to no longer be countering the right turning tendencies, whatever caused the LTE, after that is when the tail rotor or tail boom was hit by the rotor blades and disconnected. So I don't think it came apart and then this happened. I think it happened and then it came apart. A comprehensive review of the aircraft's logbook and maintenance records established that there had been no recent maintenance actions, reported anomalies, or structural repairs involving the tail boom or tail rotor assemblies prior to the accident sequence. That's not to say we don't have like a pitch link problem, because they don't talk about it. Well, like we saw with the Bell 222, but it doesn't sound like there's anything to indicate a mechanical problem at the preliminary juncture right now. The main rotor hub, main rotor transmission, and 3 main rotor blades were located about 165 feet south of the main wreckage. The 4th main rotor blade grip, and portion of its respective yoke were not located within the main rotor assembly. It was separated from the rotor hub and located 650 feet northeast of the main wreckage. All blades, which is probably the one that hit the tail boom, because once it hit, it separated. All blades were lightly coated with an orange-yellow oil film. Post-accident examination of the helicopter revealed no evidence of ballistic puncture, so that was another thing. They charged the guy with murder for this crash. It may still stick because in Arizona law, if a crash happens and the reason they were there was because of the crime you were committed, like crashing a car in a pursuit or something like that, they can add those charges. Whether it sticks, I don't know. But there's no direct evidence that he was shooting at the helicopter and hit the helicopter. He may have been shooting at the helicopter, but he didn't hit the helicopter, according to this. A review of video and NTSB data revealed the helicopter's closest proximity to the suspect at the time of the shots fired was about 7,500 feet. So not really in the ballpark. And there you can see again, picture of the wreckage distribution and composite of the video. Main wreckage, main transmission, rotor blades, furthest wreckage. They downloaded the ECU, and review revealed 16 trend records and 4 high-resolution snapshots totaling 20 lines of data over an 18-second period. For initial 6 seconds of the recording, the helicopter was operating at high power, right? High altitude, high power for the out-of-ground effect hover. And the gas generator speed was between 100 and 101. Main rotor speed remained stable at 100. Engine torque was between 76 and 80. The power lever angle was consistent or constant at 66 degrees, which was consistent with the Fly D10. During the next 1.2 seconds, the collective was reduced to 48%. Fuel flow decreased. Simultaneously, NG reduced to 97%. And the rotor and power turbine speed both reduced to 98%. The following 1.2 second interval, beginning at 9.6 seconds, showed 98%, while NG increased to 102, torque increased to 92 with a fuel flow of 420, increased of measured gas temperature of 1460. Next recorded data 1.2 seconds later showed the NG decreased to 95, NR to 97, NP to 96, and torque to 60. Collective was reduced to 10%. During the subsequent 1.1 seconds, the ECU recorded transition to reversionary governor, and this is probably when it came apart. NR decreased to 0, NP increased to 112 over speed. So this is when it comes apart, right? Because your rotor, it's measuring the rotor speed, whether that sensor came apart or what happened, it's hit the tail boom. Now the engine overspeeds because it's got no resistance against it. So consistent with instantaneously removal of the rotor load from the power turbine. Yeah, that is when we lost everything, and they were just along for the ride at that point. During the final 5.2 seconds, PLA was reduced to 28 degrees. The engine core remained operational. NG stabilized at 63. So the engine, it's not an engine problem, but you can see the data, 100, 100, 100, and everything is good, and then probably lowered the collective when this started, but it wasn't able to arrest it. Unfortunately, the pilot was very experienced and was probably working on night vision goggles. They don't know his total flight hours, but according to the FAA, 3,500 hours in civil helicopters, served in Marine Corps from 88 to 2010. He's also attached to a Marine Helicopter Squadron 1, HMX-1, as a pilot. The pilot of another helicopter, which was en route to land at the hospital at the same time, said that the wind was from the northeast at about 10 to 15 knots. High-resolution model showed that between 9,500 and 10,000 was about 20 knots from the east-southeast. According to the Naval Observatory, it was basically 7.6% moon illuminated, so bright moon, and moonrise was at 2113, so probably not a factor there. So if you look at the helicopter flying handbook, loss of tail rotor effectiveness is an unanticipated yaw, defined an uncommanded rapid yaw towards the advancing blade, which does not subside on its own accord. It goes on to explain that the tail rotor, the whole purpose of the tail rotor is to keep the aircraft straight, essentially. You've got anti-torque pedals. The torque of the rotor blades causes it to want to yaw to the right in a helicopter like the Bell 407. Anti-torque pedal, when you apply left anti-torque pedal, that reduces, it causes a load on the engine and reduces that tendency to turn right. However, the higher you go, the less effective it is because the air is less dense and you have less power and you're needing more power for your operations, especially when you're talking an out-of-ground effect hover. Hovering at high altitude, you do not have ground effect, so you're trying to push less dense air at higher altitude where the engine's not operating as efficiently as it could. Now, it's a turbine, so it's going to be better, but it's not as efficiently as it would be at, say, sea level, and it's increasing the amount of power required to do that. Wind also can be a factor. There's different types: main rotor disc interference, weathercock stability, tail rotor vortex ring state, because the way the wind hits the tail rotor blade can also kind of negate some of the tail rotor effects because of that air. So at altitude, that's really the biggest thing, and that's where this is probably a factor. At higher altitudes where the air is thinner, tail rotor thrust and efficiency are reduced. Because of the high density altitude, power plants may be much slower to respond to power changes. When operating at high altitudes and high gross weights, especially while hovering, the tail rotor thrust may not be sufficient to maintain directional control, and loss of tail rotor effectiveness can occur. In this case, the hovering ceiling is limited by the tail rotor thrust and not necessarily power available. In these conditions, gross weights need to be reduced and or operations need to be limited to lower density altitudes. This may not be noted as criteria on the performance charts. So reducing the onset of LTE to help reduce the onset, they want you to maintain maximum power on rotor RPM. You saw the rotor RPM started to droop a little bit per the report. If the main rotor RPM is allowed to decrease, the anti-torque thrust available is decreased proportionally, right? Because they're connected. Avoid tailwinds below airspeed of 30 knots. Remember, we saw in the red, they were in that 10 knot, 0 to 10 knot region, and they slowed way below 30 knots. So a tailwind at that is now causing, which they had, more than likely, depending on which report you're looking at, they did have a bit of a tailwind. If loss of translational lift occurs, it results in an increased power demand and additional anti-torque pressure. So you're getting to the point where you're all the way with left pedal and it's not keeping it from rotating. Avoid out-of-ground effect operations at high power demand situations below airspeeds of 30 knots at low altitudes. They were high MSL, but low AGL. Be especially aware of wind direction and velocity when hovering in winds of about 8 to 12 knots. A loss of translational lift results in an unexpected high power demand and increased anti-torque requirement. Be aware that if a considerable amount of left pedal is being maintained, a sufficient amount of left pedal may not be available to counteract an unanticipated right yaw. So things might be working out great. You're in that, you're in that turn, which is what they were, almost in a hover at 0 knots, and that unexpected wind, now it creates an LTE situation. Be alert to changing wind conditions, which if we saw, there's 3 different reports of what the winds were, which may be experiencing when fly along ridge lines and around buildings. I mean, they're in terrain. Execute right turn slowly. This limits the effects of tail rotating inertia and decreases the load on the tail rotor to control yawing. So that's to reduce. They were in a left turn. So if it happens, the only way out is to apply full left pedal, forward cyclic control, and then reduce power. It seems like he did reduce power, but also it kind of seemed like by the time he did it, it was too late because what happens is once the main rotor gets to a point where you're putting such a high demand on it, it'll start flexing. And if it flexes into the tail boom, that's it. We've got evidence of that, especially with the spinning rotation. So you have a very small window to recover when you get into this LTE situation. That's not to say it wasn't mechanical. These are the immediate thoughts, right? You see this, seems to be a setup of the perfect scenario for an LTE at high altitude that a lot of people talked about when I did the last video. However, this is preliminary and it could have been mechanical. There could have been something that was missed. Just because they didn't work on it recently doesn't mean there wasn't some kind of maintenance thing that they missed. There's no indication as of right now that anything specifically was wrong with that helicopter. And the problem is it's hard to reconcile because it was a very experienced helicopter pilot that had been flying helicopters for a long time and been flying 407s and doing this very operation. So it's hard to reconcile the two. Now, they started their shift at 8 o'clock. This is 10 p.m. Who knows what time he got up? They don't talk about the 48-hour history, whether he had cumulative fatigue, had been up. Obviously, if you're starting your shift at 8 o'clock, you got to get up before 8 o'clock. So he's probably up 6, 7 a.m. It's not insurmountable, but it's definitely a long day, especially being the second mission that he's flown and the hikers and stuff. So fatigue could be an issue. Task saturation, you're worried about the people on the ground and the active shooter. You're trying to get out of the way of the air med helicopter and a little distracted and it gets away from you. I've been there. I've seen that. But, there by the grace of God go I. Any of us can make mistakes that, most of the time we're lucky and we get by and go, man, that was close. And sometimes it becomes fatal. But they'll look at the maintenance records and probably examine the wreckage to find out if there was anything specifically wrong with the helicopter or if it ended up being a pilot error situation, which unfortunately a lot of times it is because flying is a dangerous business and sometimes people make mistakes. So, but let me know in the comments what you think. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.